Hi, this is Richard Chamberlain, and welcome to the Protecting Your Family's Future podcast. This is episode number 25, and today we're going to be talking about how to qualify for Medicaid assistance for long-term care. Now, last week we looked at what is Medicare and what is Medicaid in the long-term care context, and what does each cover. Specifically, what does Medicare cover, leaving the rest to Medicaid. We talked in that episode about how Medicaid is a program that's available to people, and it will cover long-term care expenses, but there are asset limits and income limits. And I promised that today, this week, we would get to what those limits are. So let's dive in. First of all, when we talk about Medicaid qualification, we know that there's an asset limit. A person can't have more than $2,000 of assets to their name in order to qualify for Medicaid. Now, an important thing to realize is that we're not talking about total assets, we're talking about countable assets. There are countable assets, and then there are exempt assets. The exempt assets, sometimes they're called non-countable. So what can you have that's not countable towards your asset limit? Well, you can have a prepaid burial contract. You can have a vehicle. You can have life insurance with a cash value of up to $1,500. And that's about it. Really, some personal property and things like that, but that's it. Now, if you're married, it's going to be different, and we're going to talk about married people in a little bit. So that's the asset limit, $2,000 of countable assets, and you can't have more than $2,742 per month of income. Now, a thing to remember on that is you can only keep $50 of that, and the rest of that income goes to pay the nursing home, and then the state, through the Medicaid program, picks up the balance. So if you have less income than that amount, you can qualify, but you don't get to keep that whole amount. So that's the rules basically for single people. Now, for married people, it gets a lot more complicated, and you'll have to forgive me because there's going to be a lot of numbers here. I'm going to try to keep the math to a minimum, but there are a lot of numbers and a lot of concepts here to go through. So when we talk about a married couple, the first thing we do is we talk about who's who. So we have an institutionalized spouse. That's the spouse who is in the nursing home. And then the community spouse. That's the one who's not in the nursing home, who's living out in the community. So there are still the asset and income limits that apply. So the asset limits first. The community spouse is allowed to keep a certain amount of the combined total countable assets. So we don't say, well, those are the institutionalized spouse's assets, and these are the community spouse's assets, and the community spouse gets to keep all of their assets. That's not the way that works. They total them all up, and the community spouse can keep a portion of the combined total countable assets. Still the same rules for countable and exempt. Now, when there is a community spouse, the home is an exempt asset because they, continue to live in it. So that is not a countable asset. So when we're talking about what can the community spouse keep, don't count the home in these calculations. So the general rule is the community spouse can keep half of the countable assets, but subject to a minimum and a maximum. So what are those numbers? The minimum for 2023 is $29,724. That's the total countable assets minimum that the community spouse can keep. And the maximum is $148,620. So let's put some numbers, some hypotheticals in there to kind of make that make sense. So let's say that the total countable assets for the couple is $25,000. Of course, that doesn't count the home, $25,000 of countable. Half of that would only be $12,500, and the minimum that the spouse can keep is the $29,724. So in this case, the community spouse gets to keep the entire $25,000. If there's $50,000, half of that would be $25,000, which is still less than the minimum. So in this case, they would keep the minimum $29,724. If there's $100,000 of total countable assets, half of that would be $50,000. Well, that's what the community spouse can keep. Half of those assets are $50,000. Let's say that there's $297,240. That's exactly half of the maximum. So the maximum is $148,620. That's what the community spouse can keep in that case. If they have, let's say, $500,000, half of that would be $250,000, but I'm sorry, all that the community spouse can keep is the maximum $148,620. So I know that's a lot of numbers. I'm sorry. This kind of planning gets very complicated and very number oriented. And that's just the way this program runs. So that's the asset limits. Now there are also income limits. There are really one main concept. The community spouse can keep an amount of income so that they are not impoverished. So we call that the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. Sometimes we call that the MMNA. And that number, the community spouse is allowed to keep $2,288 of income. Meaning, if they have income of less than that amount, then they can shift a portion of the institutionalized spouse's income to themselves so that they hit the minimum. Now, that minimum, is the minimum. We can also add to that a shelter allowance if their, housing costs are more than a certain amount. But the maximum monthly maintenance needs allowance is, again, for 2023, $3,715. So why do we go through all this? Well, it's important to know that when someone is in a nursing home and they're running out of money, or they have run out of money, what can the community spouse keep? Or even better yet, if we're thinking about long-term care planning is something that we want to think about, a long-term care stay is something that we think might be in our future, how can we plan for that? It's important to know these are the worst case scenarios. We can only keep this much. We can only have this much income. How do we shelter what we need to shelter so that we don't have a spouse who is only getting the minimum income allowable under the law, who can only keep a maximum of about $150,000 if we've got much more than that saved up? How do we protect that? Now, starting next week, we're going to be talking about some tools that we can use to start to plan for long-term care. But knowing these numbers, knowing these concepts is really important. So I thank you for bearing with us as we go through this foundational information. Next week, we're going to start talking about, as I said, planning concepts, and I hope you'll join me for that. I hope today's been helpful for you, though, and I appreciate you being here. We'll see you next week.